The following is an AZPM original production.
From the radio studios of AZPM, welcome to the latest edition of The Press Room. I'm Steve Goldstein. Coming up, following criticism of Project Blue-related secrecy, Pima County acts to implement new transparency rules. And why did thousands of people decide to apply for jobs at an ICE expo in Texas? A group of journalists joins me to discuss those stories and more next on The Press Room. Welcome to The Press Room. I'm Steve Goldstein, joined by our panel of Southern Arizona journalists, Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star, Danyelle Khmara of AZPM News. Hello.
Hi.
Joe Ferguson of the Tucson Sentinel and Rafael Carranza of AZ Luminaria. Guys, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. So, Joe, I don't know if this is the gift that keeps on giving or not. For a program like this, it kind of is. So more Project Blue-related items. Pima County Board of Supervisors approved transparency rules related to non-disclosure agreements. I want to start off with this. It seems quite important considering transparency, secrecy was one of the major criticisms of Project Blue.
Yeah, I think that this was a natural follow to what happened after the city council made their decision. I think there were 12 different members of the elected bodies that were very unhappy that they were tied to NDAs that they didn't know anything about, that they didn't sign themselves, and they were facing this backlash from the public saying, we want answers, and they're saying, we can't give them to you even if we did know them because of this NDA. And when you're talking about somebody like, we assume Amazon, those NDAs carry some backing and can be potentially, hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits. So,
Tim, one thing that came up at the time in the discussion, which is still ongoing, is that it seemed like the supervisors themselves weren't even sure what NDAs they were under. And I wonder if this is going to help clarify that for at least whether they'll know or they wanted the excuse to say they didn't know.
Well, that's not my understanding, but maybe you understand better. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I believe in Hannah Cree's story, my colleague Hannah Cree, she said that the supervisors, so basically there's two new policies that are going to be around NDAs, and one of the pieces was that supervisors will receive a confidential summary of all active NDAs every quarter. And I believe that was because Supervisor Matt Hines said that he wasn't even exactly aware that he was under an NDA or what that covered.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
And there was an existing policy where the chair of the board was supposed to know about all of these NDAs. And because Adelita left when she left and Rex came on, Adelita had a policy that she said, if it's big enough that I should know about it, everybody should know about it. So she wasn't briefed. Mm-hmm. And then Rex came on and the policy hadn't changed. So there was this gap where the policy that they had in place wasn't carried out.
Yeah.
And so that carried for a bigger problem that probably wouldn't have happened in a normal year.
Rafael, your colleagues at Luminaria have been all over this, whether it's figuring out that Amazon was involved. What stands out to you about some of the latest things we've seen there?
Well, I think the latest is that, there's a chance that Project Blue could still happen, even though the city of Tucson voted against annexation. And that's because the company behind it, Building Infrastructure, has signaled that they are interested in several locations around the county. And so I think that kind of brings onus back to the county, who had signed this deal earlier in the summer. And so now, it's the pressure is going to be on them, especially because it has received such significant opposition from the community. And at their next meeting coming up, I'm sure they'll be hearing quite a bit from community leaders who are still opposed, or community people who are opposed to Project Blue altogether.
Well, Danyelle, that really stood out about Hannah's story as well. About there was a ton of protesters who were still coming and still wanted to talk about this. And I think back to Save Our Schools and how there was this incredible push at the Capitol day after day after day. And then Arizona voters, in fact, said, yes, we don't want to expand ESAs. But they didn't stop the legislature then later from saying, no, we're going to expand this anyway. So I think for a lot of observers, it was good to see that there was still this activism. One would think it wouldn't run out after a few weeks, but it was still good for them to see, like, no, we still know Project Blue could happen, as Rafa said.
Yeah, so it could still happen, but the county showed with these two new policies that they enacted that they are paying attention to the backlash and that they want to respond to that. And I'll just mention what the basics of what those two policies are. So they shortened the NDA length to a maximum length of 2 years, down from 5. And then they also said that there needs to be an environmental review that would go along with having an NDA. So, something like that could go a long way to even answer some of what the people against it were saying, which was that there's just not enough information for us to make this decision.
But Tim, that environmental aspect of it, the economic aspects of it, the connection there is so important because other than secrecy, the thing that keeps coming up is, do we have enough water and energy for this kind of thing?
Yeah, well, it's important in two different ways. One is we want to know those answers from the outset or as early as possible. But the other is that along with the NDA are things that likely would scare off some businesses that maybe are on the borderline as far as whether they want to consider Tucson or not. Like if they aren't going to get the NDA they want, then they just might look somewhere else. If they're going to have to go through an additional environmental review, then they may just forego Tucson. So there's a risk. Every layer of regulation or review we add, may lose us an opportunity. On the other hand, it's probably better to know early in the process that a project is not wanted by either the elected officials or the populace than to know late in the game, as we did with this.
Yeah, Danyelle, you and then Joe.
Yeah, and that was the supervisor that was against the new policies put into place. Steve Christie said that the business leaders were not consulted on the new policies and that the policies would discourage economic growth.
Okay, Joe?
Well, I would also like to say that it might not be a county decision. We see the Sarita and Marana looking at maybe doing their own thing, state lands, federal lands. We might have an interesting issue where the Arizona Department of Water Resources makes a decision about a data center, not the people we've elected.
Well, yeah, and the 100-year water supply, whether that relates to anything here. But Joe, let me follow up with you on this because before the agenda was on vacation for a bit, there was this headline that stood out, and I can't remember the exact words on it, forgive me, but I wanted to ask you about kind of the activist question. When Tucson gets activated, then things happen, and I'm curious as to whether you think there will continue to be this passionate opposition to Project Blue.
I think there will be, but I think that, you're going to lose some people. If this data center is built in Sarita, I don't think you're going to see the kind of turnout you did at the TCC necessarily. If they decide to build a air-cooled data center that is somewhat smaller than what we've heard plans for, I think you're going to lose people who are solely concerned about water. Mm-hmm. So I think that, these are kind of some of the issues that are going to come into play. But if this is something that's going to attack our water supply, is going to endanger our power and whether or not we have electricity in the middle of summer, I think you're going to see people turn out over and over again, regardless of how long this goes on.
Well, and that's the thing, the project representatives were saying that the project was going to be water positive. And we saw, a lot of people, union members that were speaking for it saying, look what they're saying. They're saying it's going to be water positive. But they weren't presenting the data that would show that. So it's, it's an argument that it seems like to me could be answered by having actual data to back up those claims.
Tim?
Well, I mean, a good thing about where we are now is that, yes, they've come back with kind of there's still interest. And I think really we never didn't want $1 billion investment in Tucson. It was all about the details, like what impacts it'll have on our power and water and air pollution. Those are the details. And so if you can continue to negotiate and maybe even further mitigate those concerns, maybe there is a deal to be struck somewhere here.
Joe, briefly?
I was just going to say, kudos to everybody who did not use the word water positive in their stories. I really appreciate that, not using the buzzwords that they were trying to push because, that was a real hard pill to swallow. And I think that was one of the things that stood out among the activists is that no one was buying that.
Rafael, final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to that water use, I think my colleague, Yana, when she was writing about this project initially, she also looked at, other Amazon data centers, around the country and found that, the things that they were saying when it comes to the use of water didn't necessarily add up to, what it came out at the after it already was built and how much water was being used. So even, these claims about, being water positive, it still needs some vetting because, these are estimates. And so once a data center is operational, there could be a number of factors that could change that output.
Yeah. Rafael, let me stick with you on this. So Democratic State Senator Danyelle Ortiz has been targeted for removal from office by Republican Senator Jake Hoffman, who's better known for being part of the Freedom Caucus. Senator Ortiz had gone on social media to let her constituents know when ICE agents were near schools, for example. And I think she compared it to some extent, if you're on the road and you're warning someone that, a cop is on the side of the street with a radar gun. Give us a little background for folks in Southern Arizona who may not know much about Senator Ortiz.
Yeah, so Senator Ortiz began as a reporter. She was a television reporter before running for office, and she's now, works at she was elected to the legislature. She represents Maryvale and West Phoenix. It's a largely Hispanic majority community, and so her argument is that these were operations that were happening in broad daylight with masked officers or masked agents, and so the idea she claims that she was doxing these officers is not accurate because this was already happening, and she was simply sharing information that was shared with her on social media. So that's the claim that she has been making. But she is, because she represents Maryvale, she also has been relatively outspoken about the current federal immigration crackdown, and particularly because of the secrecy of some of these operations where you don't see the officers' faces, and sort of the fear that kind of creates among community members. She has really taken like a leading role in sort of speaking to that and trying to assure her constituents in her district, which are majority Latino. And so I think that has really kind of thrust her into this larger conversation over whether or the claim from Republicans that that she's getting in the way of what ICE is doing.
And she says she has no intention of backing down, and her personality is such that I would believe her.
Yeah, and I think that because she's already put herself out there on the record to many of these things. She also has been attending the community meetings that the Monitor team organizes for the racial profiling lawsuit that Maricopa County is still kind of under, and a lot of the things that she talks about publicly now that she has talked about in this whole ordeal are things that she also has brought up to this ongoing kind of settlement meetings where she talks about the need for police to regain the trust of Latinos, but it's hard to do that if you don't know if your local police is involved in this or not, and a large part of that goes with the fact that these agents are largely masked and not showing their faces, they're not showing their badges, a lot of times not even identifying themselves.
Yeah. Tim, what stands out for you about this?
I mean, I want to know if the Freedom Caucus really stands for freedom.
Right.
I mean, there is a freedom of speech, freedom of association. There's questions like this that arise in this episode. I mean, she has all the right in the world to say that there are ICE agents on the street in her district. That is part of that is a protected speech, and then to call it doxing is the most absurd thing. We hear that sometimes in journalism, that you're doxing someone by like naming someone who spoke publicly about an issue or what have you. I mean, what really happened here is Libs of TikTok, which is a very right-wing Twitter account and such, pointed her out and tried to sick people on Senator Ortiz for making this post. So Jake Hoffman and those people are just following the lead there, but it's ridiculous from my point of view.
Yeah, Danyelle, it kind of seems like too that there would be people who would be wanting their elected lawmakers to maybe do what Senator Ortiz is doing, because again, as Tim points out, freedom of speech, actually get more involved and say, especially in communities that are nervous about these crackdowns, but also the fact that the masks are another thing, a different level. It takes a different level. If you're actually with the government, shouldn't I be able to see your face to recognize whether you actually are, whether I like ICE or not, whether you're actually with ICE or you're just some random person?
Yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing issue. So, there's many community members that feel afraid about the idea of masked people who may or may not be showing ID, arresting people. But then, others who say they need to be masked in order to protect themselves. And that kind of goes back to when we were talking about could what she did be considered doxing, which again doesn't make a whole lot of sense because A, it was in a public space. B, they had masks on and she didn't name their names anyway. And then maybe somewhat ironically, she's been saying that she's actually been getting harassed because of her post and calling this out. So it may be kind of the opposite. That's what is happening.
Okay.
I'll also add that Ortiz is not alone here in terms of, the position that she finds herself in. This is something that we have seen around the country, particularly, as this immigration crackdown has expanded. We saw it, for example, with the mayor of Nashville during some ICE raids in partnership with the Tennessee Highway Patrol. And, the Republican legislators there opened up a congressional investigation into whether he was also obstructing ICE by criticizing these operations. We also see, for example, in cities around the country, democratic cities like LA, who the federal government has really gone after so-called sanctuary cities, and I think LA is kind of like the prime example where they've sent in the National Guard. They're conducting all these widespread immigration operations, and I think that you can draw a very clear line of that. A lot of that has to do with the fact that these are, elected leaders who are very opposed to or at the opposite end of where the Trump administration stands when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, Tim, that point's interesting because we're seeing Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Chicago. Tucson is smaller and probably hasn't quite garnered the attention of the Trump administration because it's not quite big enough. Is that something that people you're hearing that people in Tucson are concerned about?
You mean the
that
arrival of
might be some crackdown in the same sense?
I mean, I haven't heard anything like that. I think we're just too small, a little bit off the radar. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened in Phoenix. But it doesn't strike me as it just hasn't played out that way so far.
Danielle, have you heard?
I'm not sure that these agencies have the infrastructure in Tucson to do the sort of full scale types of raids that we're seeing in places like Los Angeles. But I have been talking to people, in particular, migrants' rights activists and people that do work around the migrant community, who have been telling me that there have been plenty of incidents of mass agents detaining people. So I think it is still happening, even in a place that's as small as Tucson.
Do you want to weigh in, Joe?
I was just going to say that, I think we see that we had a real hard push to say that we weren't a sanctuary city a couple years back. And I think that right now that might be paying some small dividends, even though I think Danielle's right. This is happening. It's just happening on a smaller scale. It doesn't get the same kind of headlines it gets in other communities.
Yeah.
So, well, the thing that would really change this dynamic in Tucson is if Border Patrol got involved, and we have tons of Border Patrol, thousands of Border Patrol agents in southern Arizona, and Border Patrol is being used in the Los Angeles area, which of course isn't nearly as close to the Mexican border as Tucson is. So I have not seen any signs that that's happening here or going to happen here, but they have done so in other places.
Yeah, Rafael?
I'll also add that, even though it's not happening, say, to the extent here in Tucson, but we do have, a very big military base down here that is used, or has kind of become like a hub now for a lot of this, surveillance efforts, and particularly, when we talk about LA, some of like the drones that were surveilling, some of the protesters there, they came out of Arizona. So, I think Arizona is still playing a role, even if it's not directly in the sense of, the immigration operations that we're seeing in other cities.
Go ahead.
Well, and I'll just add to that with the push to, hire, I think, 10,000 more ICE agents in the next year, we don't really know what things are going to look like in the year to come.
Yeah. Rafael, let me close out more on Annalise Ortiz on this. So another Republican state senator, Shauna Bolick, wife of an Arizona Supreme Court justice, wants the U.S. attorney for Arizona, so federal, to look into whether Ortiz committed a federal crime by potentially interfering with federal law enforcement. How closely should we need to watch that to see if it goes to a federal level? It seems like that would be a bit of a leap.
Well, I think there's been a very clear mandate from the Trump administration, for all the U.S. Attorney's Office around the country, particularly those along the border, to really hone in and focus on immigration and immigration-related crimes. So if, the U.S. Attorney here decides that this is something he wants to pursue, this isn't something that I think Arizona has necessarily, avoided in the past. We've seen, the prosecution, for example, of humanitarian aid volunteers. And so, I think that the possibility is definitely there, but I think it's going to be the U.S. Attorney here in Arizona who makes that determination. And then, whether it kind of, another venue there if it does kind of reach the Arizona Supreme Court there. This is the Republicans are asking potentially to strip her of her committee assignments, and so if that kind of escalates into potential Supreme Court territory, I think that could also raise some questions about Bollock's and her husband being a judge on the Supreme Court.
I think Bollock got the headline she wanted with the complaints, and I think that we've seen over and over again that legislators are protected under legislative immunity no matter how fast they drive their cars or what they tweet, and so I expect this will go nowhere.
Well, in the old days, I would have just said it's politics, but we've seen politics has changed a little bit over the past decade or so. So, Tim, are there going to be elections in 2026? You talked with
definitely
Arizona
not.
Secretary of State Adrian
They're going to be
Fontes,
suspended.
who has talked about that for a while. But in a column you wrote, there's some politics to this as well. But I think Secretary Fontes actually is concerned about that. What did he say to you?
Yeah, so Secretary of State Adrian Fontes is, of course, the top election official in Arizona. And he laid out a case that he thinks the Trump administration is preparing the groundwork for suspending or not holding the 2026 elections. He lays out 5 points. One is, I'm going to have to look down at my notes here. One is the rhetoric of you won't, if you vote for me in 2024, this is last year he said this, you won't have to vote again. Another is the dismantling of protective agencies such as CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which has helped protect voter election systems around the country. They've been degraded, or certain aspects of their operations have been degraded. Another point he makes is the threat to investigate local election officials, local and state election officials, investigate and prosecute, which has come out of the Trump administration. Then there have been executive orders or threatened executive orders about ending mail-in voting, among other things. And finally, he points out there is National Guard and federal agents, especially in the form of ICE, on the ground in many cities, or there may be by this time next year. So he comes to the conclusion, based on those 5 points, that the Trump administration is setting up the basis for suspending the elections, like declaring an emergency of some sort.
And Joe, we know Secretary Fontes is running for re-election next
Yes.
year, so he's concerned about this.
Well, I think so, but I think there's some rhetoric. I'm not saying that he's wrong, but I mean, we know that the Trump administration has no problem with a Colorado clerk who broke election guidelines. He wants her suspension waived. Mm-hmm. I think that we've seen, that there's great efforts in Texas and Maryland and Missouri to add congressional districts in 2026. So one of these two has to be right, and we are not sure which one it is. It's our job to report what's going on in our neighborhoods, in our backyards. Arizona is unlikely to have a fight over congressional districts, but at the same time, I think that, there's a lot going on to try to get more Republican districts in 2026 right now. So I do expect there to be an election next year.
Yeah, well, so those are two different visions. There's the vision of he's working to suspend the elections, which is what Adrian Fontes was making the case about. But this other one that Joe talks about is probably more realistic, which is really trying to frame form the electoral landscape in such a way that it makes it much more beneficial for the Republican Party. That definitely is happening. So that we can see that with the redistricting in Texas and elsewhere. And so it may be that Fontes has gone too far in this projection, but definitely the other is already taking place.
Well, Rafael, that's where there's some irony in this to me, that Republicans in this state created mail-in voting. President Trump liked it, then didn't like it, then didn't like it. Now he liked it, now he doesn't like it again. It would seem that would be something that actually some of the policies he might want to implement would seem to hurt Arizona Republicans, it would seem, potentially. Especially because we have an independent redistricting commission, and at this point we can't change the districts to benefit one party or another, for example.
Yeah, I think it would seem that, but I think because this has now kind of been a multi-year project where they're casting doubt on the integrity of early voting. We saw for example that in this last general election there were a significant number of Republican voters who showed up to vote the day of, instead of relying on early ballots as they had been for many other elections prior to that. And so I think that signaled that there is a willingness, at least on the hand of Republican voters, to stand by him when it comes to, the claims that, it's fraudulent, even though there's no evidence that, there's any, widespread fraud conspiracies with regards to early voting.
Yeah. Danyelle, does it make sense to you? Because Adrian Fontes has been someone who's on the cover of Time magazine as someone who's really standing up for democracy. Does this make sense to you for him to protect Arizona this way and speak out like he did to Tim?
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the headline, I was surprised at first, but when I read the article, I thought, okay, I mean, he is making a case. Like one of the things that I pulled out from your article was that he said that Trump is setting up a situation where people are so worried about election integrity that he can declare an emergency and suspend the elections. And, like both of you have said, I think that's probably unlikely, but I think that Fontes makes an interesting case with everything he lays out.
Yeah.
I mean, his Republican opponent, the guy who's most likely so far to be his Republican opponent, is now calling him a conspiracy theorist and stuff. This is Alex Collin, the state representative. And,
last time he went against Mark Fincham, and we know Mark Fincham's feelings on these things.
Yeah, I wouldn't even want to know, actually. I'm sure Fincham is the king of conspiracy theories, so he might even endorse it.
So, Tim, very briefly, about 30 seconds. Also, Fontes has refused the DOJ's request for Arizona voter registration information, saying that would be a felony if he were to do that. Mm-hmm. Is he going to be able to stand up? Is this going to be a Republican White House against a Democratic Secretary of State?
Yes, but hopefully, there's a way to work this out in that, he can release most of the information or the information that's readily obtainable without personally identifying information that isn't relevant, such as dates of birth and driver's licenses or social security numbers, if that's there. I don't know if it is.
Okay. Very quickly, Joe.
You can buy a voting list.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's data that's out there that you can get.
Okay, guys.
Yeah.
Joe Ferguson, Tucson Agenda, Tim Steller, Arizona Daily Star, Rafael Carranza, AZ Luminaria, and Danyelle Khmara of AZPM News. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for watching us on the Press Room. We'll be back next week. I'm Steve Goldstein. Thanks for watching The Press Room here on YouTube. If you have a question about something we talked about, please leave a comment below. And for more Press Room, click right here.